a really good Buckeyes recruiting class. I was sad to see that they, I guess mildly disappointed that they didn't hit on the linebacker out of California, but I guess it's good for USC that they can keep some of that California talent finally at home, and they're no longer purging it. So that's a good sign for them, maybe. I do hope that they can close out and get the defensive lineman out of Washington. I think that could create a really, really good D-line class, which I think is imperative going forward, especially in today of college football. As I told you like years ago, Mark, that was the one thing that I realized years ago. I remember I watched Ohio State play Florida State in that Sugar Bowl. I always told you in the 90s, and we couldn't block Andre Wadsworth, that star defensive tackle out of Florida State. And that's when I kind of realized the one major advantage that the Miamis and the Florida States, and then, of course, when we ran into the SEC schools like Florida and LSU, the advantage that they had at the D-line talent. And I think that's the big thing that Urban's up and, now having Larry Johnson coach the D-line, who I think is the best defensive line coach in the country, only, gives me encouragement going forward. So I'm really happy about this class from that aspect. I know we've talked about that before, just from the Ohio State insiders, and what are your thoughts?
Well, my first thought would be that when you mention Ohio State missing out on the linebacker, Rajon Davis, who made 2 trips to Columbus in the last few weeks, I think it especially hurts at that position, David, based on what we've seen out of Ohio State's linebacker for over the last 4 seasons. Even though it's been improved and tightened up to a certain extent, we've had the conversations concerning the issues there, and that would have been a nice get, especially at that position unit for the Buckeyes.
I agree. I do think that they've got some good linebackers coming in. I've seen some of the tape on guys like Powers, Reed Carrico, C.J. Hicks with these next couple classes. It will be interesting to see the level of linebacker play this year. Last year, I thought 2019, it definitely up from where it was at, certainly in 2018, and even where it was at in 2017. I think the one thing that they did lose off the 19 team, I think Malik Harrison was a fairly underrated linebacker at Ohio State. He's playing in the NFL right now with the Ravens. He's a pretty good player. So I thought their linebackers this year were kind of average. In my opinion, they just didn't have a guy that stood out. And plus, nowadays your linebackers have to play in space more. And I just didn't trust those linebackers to play in space. It's not, like it used to be, Mark, where you've got Andy Katzenmoyer or Chris Spielman defending the I formation or those split backfields like you did in the 80s or the 90s or even in the early 2000s with a guy like A.J. Hawk. You got to have the smaller guys who can defend the pass nowadays. So I think going forward, I think in these next couple recruiting classes, they're going to have some really good young linebackers come in. So I'm going to be encouraged by that. But overall, I think if they can get JTT out of Washington, I think it bodes for a really good class. The one other comment I want to make about just how much kind of the recruiting has come up, and maybe we've touched upon this before, but, just you think back to the Jim Tressel days, Mark, and, Tressel had started off, I would say Tressel's recruiting was great at the beginning and great at the end. He started off with that 02 class that had Maurice Clarett, who, helped them win a national title. They had Troy Smith in that class who won a Heisman. And then they had 4 first-round draft picks in that class. A.J. Hawk, Santonio Holmes, Nick Mangold, and Bobby Carpenter. So that was a great class. And then Tressel lived off that class for about 3 or 4 years. And then, his classes kind of waned after that. And I think that affected a lot of his teams. But his last couple classes, in fact, that 2011 class was a top 5 class. And remember, a lot of the players that Urban Meyer won with his first 2 years were Jim Tressel's players. What are your thoughts about kind of the differential in recruiting between the two as you noticed it?
Well, I would have to go back to look at those individual classes. So when you're assessing the Tressel performance, are you going by the recruiting ranking? Or are you going by the actual product and production of those players that were signed?
Well, I'm going on a combination of the two. The two biggest things that I think that Urban did. Because Tressel, I looked at the rankings, averaged about a top 10 recruiting rankings. The Meyer averaged probably about top 3. And the thing about it being is that Tressel also, I think, got hurt by the fact that he signed a lot of smaller classes. He signed a lot of like 14, 15-man classes. And I think the thing is Urban and now Ryan Day have to sign bigger classes because the guys are just leaving early. They've got to keep up on the numbers. So I think that's kind of the other major differential I noticed. It seemed like there was a lot of guys, like more in the Tressel years, that were staying towards their senior year, whereas the guys are just leaving early nowadays. Have you kind of noticed that as well?
Yeah, I don't think if we ran the numbers on the early entries into the NFL draft under Urban Meyer versus Jim Tressel, I don't think it would be outrageously different, but there's no question there was an uptick under Urban Meyer.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing is that's why I think he signed kind of some bigger classes because each year it seems like their recruiting classes are always at least 23, 24, sometimes even 25. Versus, as I mentioned, there were some Tressel years where he had some smaller classes in there. So that's one of the things that I noticed. And then the other thing that we talked about more is I think, Urban nationalized the recruiting a little bit more than Jim Tressel did, where, he goes out of state that much more. Because I saw the numbers on it. Tressel recruited 60-40 Ohio. Meyer went 40-60 the other way. Although I'll make this point, Mark, I think they should take a few more of those Ohio 3-stars because I'll tell you why. A few of them have developed, and it may take them a little while to develop, but a lot of them develop into pretty good players. Like Davon Hamilton and Malik Harrison on the team last year, both are pretty good NFL players. They were 3-star recruits, both Ohio guys. So, I think if they picked up because they're going to pick up 5 or 6 3-stars per recruiting class, I think if they picked up a few of those Ohio guys, a lot of them develop into pretty good players, even though it might take them till their senior year. I don't know if your Ohio people feel the Ohio State people you talk to feel the same way, or what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm going to use some rough numbers here based on just my memory of going down recruiting rankings in the state of Ohio. I would guess in the average year that Ohio produces somewhere in the range of maybe 9 to 12 4-stars, something in that range?
Yeah, that's right. I checked it. It's about 10 to 12 a year.
Okay, 10 to 12 4-stars, and then it drops off to the 3-star level. It would be an interesting, fascinating case study to take everybody at the 3-star level that Ohio State did not sign and how they turned out at other schools to see if you've got a valid point or not.
Well, one of the things is like I mentioned is like Fickle is recruited some of those 3-star guys that Ohio State's passed on, and he's winning some games with them. I'm not saying he's competing at a national title level, but I'm not saying that many of those players at Cincinnati could play at Ohio State, but you could probably find 5 or 6 of them that might be able to. Maybe a few more.
Yep. And the last point I'll make before David, we need to move on to some other callers is there's no question that your ratios are correct in regards to Jim Tressel putting the emphasis on Ohio versus Urban Meyer having a more national approach. But it would be interesting, and we'll never know, whether Jim Tressel might have had maybe not the same ratio, but a closer ratio to Urban Meyer had he been recruiting those players 10 to 15 years later, meaning that the appreciation of talent in Ohio continues. Therefore, Tressel might have been forced to recruit outside the state more than Urban Meyer.